Hi. So this is the final lecture in my series about my Wise and Power model, which arose out of my doctoral research and some development after that. I'm a UK-based dance movement therapist, and the research was focused on arts therapies with adult women survivors of child sexual abuse within a mental health setting. So this final lecture really discusses the model that I came up with in relation to other research and writing, other literature that's out there. So without any further ado, I will share my screen with you and you'll see a little me. So there I am. I'm just going to move myself over. So we're going to start here, just reminding you of the model. So the white bits are the process that the individual goes through in each turn of the cycle. And these bits here, the green bits, are to do with the therapeutic relationship. And we've looked at all of those now. I just want to show you the spiral because I haven't shown you that yet. So this is a very simplified version of a spiral that someone who may have been sexually abused in childhood might go through. So they're at the beginning, the past is played out now in my body, and then they might separate out past and present, and finally lay the abuse to rest. But at each stage there's a whole turn on that cycle, and in fact there are many more. As I say, that's way oversimplified, but it just gives you an idea. So let's move on to discussing this model. There's a mathematician called Henri Poincaré who wrote about the creative process in mathematics, but he also, I mean, he was a philosopher as well as a mathematician, and he also used illustrations of that model from artists like Picasso, if I remember rightly. And I came across that theory somehow whilst I was doing my PhD. I somehow came across that when I was reading about the creative process. I became interested in what people were describing to me, and I thought, this feels like a creative process in itself, and we're using creative processes, so I need to understand the creative process more. And so Poincaré identified 4 stages, which he called preparation, incubation, illumination, and evaluation, I think, or something like that. And I realized that what people were telling me was very similar. Judith Herman discusses the response to trauma, and in her discussion includes descriptions that are very similar to what my research participants described in terms of what I call burial and the failure to contain feelings and so on, and flashbacks and so on and so forth, that are specific to the warm-up phase that I've identified. And you may recall that the establishment of a sense of safety was absolutely crucial, and which I call a vector catalyst. And that's also well documented in other literature, and I would argue it's enshrined in Carl Rogers' core conditions. Incubation can be understood through other writers who discuss metaphor in particular. So Lakoff and Johnson wrote a wonderful book called Metaphors We Live By. Gorolich described metaphor as the mediator between all of the arts therapies. And Donald Winnicott writes about what he calls the potential space that links inner and outer experience, but is also a mediator between therapist and client. Now, other aspects of the model, mirroring, is discussed a lot in the literature. It's discussed in dance movement therapy literature in a very specific way in terms of movement mirroring, which isn't about just copying someone else. It's about mirroring something about the essence of the emotional expression within that movement. And also Fonagy, who's a psychoanalyst, he describes something very similar, and it's very crucial to the development of a sense of self, and implies benevolent witnessing of the other. It's also supported potentially through neuroscientific research around mirror neurons, but I think we have to be very careful about how we interpret that research. And you know, there have been quite a lot of critiques around that of late. Cognitive shifts, of course, like the seeing things differently that I describe in my model, are well documented as a turning point in therapeutic change, particularly in the cognitive therapy literature. But in cognitive therapy, there's a deliberate attempt to change one's thinking, whereas here it was kind of like a light bulb going on, and has more in common with insight as described in psychodynamic thinking, but I would argue is best explained through Poincaré's creative process theory. Now, probing and challenging, you could argue that this is one bit of my model that distinguishes it from Carl Rogers' ideas. His core conditions, which don't include probing and challenging, are deemed enough in that theory. They're deemed to be sufficient and necessary. But the example I give is actually around helping someone to develop their congruence. So, you know, arguably it could be understood in that theory. The concept of evaluation or grounding in everyday life is one that's kind of it's about transferring therapeutic insight into the client's normal and everyday life, which is, after all, the goal, I guess. And finally, releasing. This is part of every ending process, and therapists really should be working themselves out of a job. If they're doing a good job, they should be aiming to not be necessary in a client's life. And in this model, it was very clearly linked to re-embodiment, and paradoxically a release from embodying, i.e. burying the trauma. So results in the trauma being relegated to where it should be, in memory, rather than played out somatically in the here and now through flashbacks and so on. So here's the model again. Just a little reminder, there's the spiralic process. I'm going to leave you with some references. You should have seen these on previous slides, but there's a load of stuff there, and there's another slide of references there. If you want to review them, you can simply pause your video and rewind. That concludes my series of lectures on my WISE Empower model. It's long overdue. I've never really properly written it up in a paper, although it is referred to in some papers and chapters that I've written. It's something that's still a lot of people aren't aware of. So I'm really hoping that you can share what you've seen here. And I also really, really hope that you will comment on the videos, because I'd love to read your comments. I'd love to continue to grow myself through our dialogue. So thank you once again. I really do appreciate you watching. Thanks. Bye for now.